Hello everybody, this is Dmitry Postnikovich. I'm here in Marc's house still. I haven't gone back to Russia because a little bit they had some problems with the show last week, and we figured out the problem, and we thought before we try another show with Mr. Elmer present that we would try out the equipment and make sure everything is working. And so Marc thought he would redo the part about a book that he wanted to introduce at the last show, and he has some other books that he can share with you today. So we're doing this show. This is like a special edition show, and I just want to say, of course, you see the boys, they're not here because they're with Miss Lara, and they are in school. Although most children, I think, are not at school today because it's very beautiful outside, but it's only 6 degrees and the wind is blowing, so it feels very, very cold. We want to wish you all warm weather and warm hearts anyway, and I hope everything is good by you. And I think without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Marc, who's going to give you a smaller show today, and we are just testing the equipment, but hopefully the information will be interesting. Okay? Here is Dr. Marc. Well, thank you, Dmitry. I appreciate the introduction and really appreciate you helping us with things, as you did originally for me in my show in Cyprus years ago. I'm very happy to help you. So, yeah, I discovered something actually rather miraculous. We have this little camera that we bought based upon recommendations on Amazon, and Elmer and I got it. And then I also eventually, because the microphone inside the camera is kind of boxy in the sound. It picks up everything in the room, but there's nothing focused. So I did some more research and found a pretty good, I think what they call a directional mic, which hooks onto the top of the phone. And it sits on the faceplate that's on the top of the phone, which is often a place for an extra light to be on there, but I think we get away with having enough light on scene with what we have in the room. So I'm not too worried about that. But the mistake I made was thinking that there's a little screw on, a little metal screw that fits into the faceplate on the camera. And I thought, oh, well, so if there's any charge then necessary for the mic, it goes up into the microphone. It's actually been a true miracle what's happened, because this last year, and I think most of the time we used this directional mic, there's a little hole in the back where it has a little kind of a pin, what would you say, the pin plug, which is a stereo, and it fits into a hole in the back of the camera. And every time I turn the camera, or the microphone on, there's a little blue light inside. I did notice at our last show last week, which is the first one in January, after about a month of not doing anything, there was no light. But I thought, well, I don't know. And as you could see, there was sound for a certain period of time, but then it started to get away. I called my mentor, Rudy Lehman, who helped me do some video series. He was a professor as well, teaching videography and things in college. One of the things in our conversation, I was explaining what happened. He said, "Is there an instruction manual?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so. But I'm one of those guys that maybe I look at it real quickly and just see where the on button is, and then explore by myself." And as a teacher and as an artist, I mean, I'm really good, I think, at being very detailed and reading the instructions and things like that. But when it comes to technological stuff, I basically just expect it to work. Because that's what the electrical engineers and all those other people are for, right? And, I get the schematic and all that just to check things out. But I usually only look at those books when something doesn't work. Well, that hadn't even occurred to me. I think I figured out what the problem was, and I'll call Rudy and see. And he said, "Well, did you look at the manual?" And I remember always telling my own students many times with different musically related problems, "Did you read the instructions? Have you gone over, researched things, and looked for possible solutions, this and that?" So it's a very two-sided piece of paper. I open it up. Right there it says, "Make sure it's fully charged." I thought, charged? There's, well, it turns out there is a longer cord, which I'd long forgotten about, with the USB plug on it. And so I did charge it after I saw the information, and the blue light's back on. Hopefully it's working. I think the miraculous thing is I never once intentionally or knowingly, or probably not at all, charged that microphone all of last year when we did all those shows. And God love her, she made it through the entire year, except a couple of times when I think I forgot to turn her on. But otherwise, she made it for a year on whatever charge was in her. So I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to charge her a little bit for sure every week before Elmer comes. Make sure that the camera's as charged up as possible and the mic, so we don't have these problems. Because Elmer puts a lot of thought into things, and I already sometimes sabotage his plans with my lengthy commentaries. So my apologies, and thanks to Mr. Dimitri. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. I think we've got it worked out. So that's what this show is about. This is going to be 01 for the first new year, because it was 00 with the first year that we did, and then we're adding on. So this is a first year completed, and we did 01 last week, and this is 01 SE, Special Edition 1, with me and Dimitri. Let's jump ahead then to the only section that we're going to do on this show, which is PSI Undercover. You ready for this, Dimitri?
Oh, yeah, I think I'm ready. I think so. I think it's going to be very good. I don't think you put the books that you present to the people that you Now you just let me know if it's too good.
All right, so we're back, and this is PSI Undercover. I have a few things I just wanted to share with you. I've actually shared some of them, first one before. I am not going to get up out of this chair because it reclines backwards, and it's a bit of an effort to climb out of it, but it's very comfortable. I love this chair. This is by a Scottish pianist and professor, Kenneth Hamilton. It's called After the Golden Age, Romantic Pianism and Modern Performance. I have been at this book for a while, and then my life has been busy, complicated, various things going on. Then I started to read it, and then I went back like with a really good book, because I have a lot of penciled in and highlighted information, notes to myself. And when I do something like that with a book, there's a few things occasionally. And I get away from it for a while. I like to go back and review the information again and just at least catch up on the highlighted stuff. But this is a really wonderful book. And I would say, to preface it, well, not to get, I could go very backwards in prefacing, but I spent a lot of time growing up with my maternal grandparents, and they kept a very strong interest in their own lives and then passed it on to me for the past, for the family, for the way things were, how things had changed. And I think they were very aware of that, and it was kind of unique to them. They were both from farming families up north of Springfield, or in Grandpa's case, way west up in the hills. And yet they moved into the city, and they lived city lives. They were, well, Grandma, I think, was maybe next to youngest of 5 siblings. Grandpa was the youngest of 14 kids. And they moved into the city, but they were getting into their 30s at the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And it very clearly had a very strong impact on them because, of course, after the 30s, there was the Second World War. It was a tough life for folks that grew up at that time. And there's photographs of them. Their son, my Uncle Roland, was in D-Day, the second wave that went into France. And I think, I wouldn't say they lived in the past, but they remembered it with honor. And the family and the various friends and people they'd known, some well-known folks of sorts. And I was around that, and I spent my summers off and on with them. I really liked being with my grandparents. And my grandfather, I remember after he died, he had this ritual where he would disappear at about 10:45 and go back into his room and pull down his secretary desk, the front cover of it, and he'd write in a diary. And you were not allowed to be in there, you were not allowed to disturb him or bother him, and it was always private. He locked it, put it away. After he died, I was able to, Grandma had died before him, I was able to go into the estate and start helping Mom gather things, and I found the diaries, lots of them, going back almost Grandpa's entire life. He used these little pocket ones that would fit in your front shirt pocket. So he didn't write a lot. What is interesting, though, is coming from a farming family, I know you guys say, what's this got to do with music? Well, I'm almost done. He wrote down the temperatures and more or less what the weather was like. So if anybody wanted to know what the weather was more or less like in western central Ohio over the previous century before his death in 1984, he was 87 when he died. Grandpa's diaries would be a big help to that. But I remember seeing in January 30th, 1962, Rhoda had a boy today. And then he retired that spring and wrote in his time, retired today, devoting the rest of my time to my grandson. And he really did. Grandpa was a huge influence on me, and I've shared some things in previous shows. I won't get any more into that, but I'd say I grew up with a great appreciation for things before my time. My father was a very well-trained pianist, and he eventually, to survive, he had to take a job. He was a productions expediter and blueprint inspector for the International Harvester Company. He also taught himself how to tune pianos, and he did that regularly. Every weekend he'd go tune pianos, make some more money on the side. Sometimes he'd do 3 in a day. And I went with him sometimes. Went to some old churches, some, not often to the private homes, sometimes, if there were big ones and he knew where they were. But the churches were cool because I could wander around, and this was the later 60s, 70s, and Springfield had been a very wealthy and powerful business town. And so there was a lot of nice things from the previous generation or two, for sure, left in the city all over the place. And I, got to hear some older pianos that were different. And then Dad always talked about pianos from the great period of America, which was the first quarter of the 20th century, really. After the Great Depression, there was a huge number of makers that died off. And for various reasons, there were still fine pianos made throughout the time, but a lot of people really believe that access to the great raw materials and the carefully honed technical skills of the builders and the craftsmen made for extraordinary piano building, anywhere one might say from the 1880s to the 1920s. And in my time, then I was able to play some incredible pianos. But Dad used to talk about some of the great pianos and makers and pianos that he had played, his teacher owned. And when I was in Madison, there was a piano rebuilder and tuner and all that, Tim Farley pianos. They're still there. I don't think they're probably as expansive as they had been, but they got really into old pianos, bringing them. So I played a straight-strung 1864-65 Steinway with cherry finish. I played what they called the Voice of God, which was an 1880 or 1883 Steinway C with silver-wound bass strings. Had some Mason Hamlins, A.B. Chase, some really extraordinary pianos from the very earliest part of the 20th century. And I always noticed that on most of them, the mechanism was quite fleet. There's none of this like, the harder and the more stiff the piano is, the better it is to build your muscles so you can, No, it was very fleet. And if you listen to the recordings from back in those days, you imagine for the guys to play as brilliantly and as fast and as almost easily as they do, the piano could not have been getting in the way. So I played a bunch of instruments like that. And then my teacher at the time, I've mentioned many shows, Ellsworth Snyder, my postmaster's teacher, he was very supportive of my work and my things. And he actually arranged to get some scholarship money for me to go and study with Malcolm Bilson, great forte pianist, wonderful musician, at Ithaca, at Cornell. And I took lessons with him off and on a few times. I also attended a wonderful summer conference that they did in northern Indiana at, I always forget it, but at the Mennonite University up there in northern Indiana. And Bilson was one of the guest speakers. The other speaker, I don't remember his name off the top of my head. I have mentioned him before and credited him on a previous show. But Bilson, of course, represented the forte piano in the 18th century. And he played all the Mozart sonatas at that conference. And then he lectured about things. And there were some wonderful shared moments where the other guy who was presenting was, at that time, a postdoctoral fellow from California, I believe, who had begun to seriously research the oldest recordings and various writings and things about piano playing, and the idea that that the 19th century was in fact intentionally and empirically, in terms of study and teaching and so forth, different from what we do later in the known 20th century. And he was basing it on the recordings that he could get access to. That guy eventually, I'm sorry, I should have looked this up before. He eventually, I think he retired from a school here in Ohio or Indiana, and there's a memorial kind of chapter that remembers his work, because he really did contribute a huge amount to 19th century performance practice research. And it was really interesting hearing Bilson and him talk to one another and see what moved from the Mozart Beethoven period into the middle years of the 19th and even later years. And of course now we've talked very excitedly about Marston Records. I'll put that up on the screen again. Elmer and I both have piano memberships with them. So every once in a while when they've got a project, then they'll send it to you. And then when I joined them, they did Robert Goldsand, wonderful pianist, originally from Vienna. I didn't know that. I thought with his name, he was probably American, naively when I first knew about him. But it turns out he was from Vienna, came from an amazing tradition. He was an incredible pianist. I'd never heard as much of his recordings as they included. I think it was a 3-disc set. And then they sent a whole bunch of other, maybe up to 20 single CDs of various things that they have put together. And Jim Marston is just amazing. And what they are pulling out of the past and then recreating it with as little interference on our time end, but at the same time utilizing the most incredible representational technology for us to hear these performances from the past. It's extraordinary to me. And as I've mentioned many times in the show, I'm going to get to it in a minute, I had some old records with a few of his performances in it, and at the time I thought they were very charming and a little odd. And at that time I think I was very biased because Arthur Rubinstein was my hero and my role model when I was growing up, and he remains a dear and beloved pianist in my mind and heart, and I never ceased to be amazed what that guy could do. It was always so beautiful and so powerful and authoritative and interesting. But I finally started to get some historic recordings of Ignaz Friedman, who was apparently kind of the Chopin interpreter before Arthur Rubinstein. He held that kind of world acknowledgement. Totally different pianists, totally different schools of playing, and Friedman is just something that you have to listen to and appreciate. I mean, the guy was magnificently skilled and the highest realms of technical ability, but it's his rubato and the way that he plays. I mean, he plays Chopin like he was writing the music. It has that kind of immediacy and freshness about it, the way that he plays, and very convincing. I mean, I think I'm fortunate in that, I don't know if the right words, I'm not an iconoclast, meaning let's put this, I'm an Aquarian, very Aquarian. Somebody read my chart one time, said there's like 9 out of 12 signs, all in, or planets and things like that, all in Aquarius. And I think my nature has always been to be curious and necessarily flexible, and open to most anything and everybody. I've been told and often felt it was true that if all the people that I have known and know were to get into a big room, and they're all friends of mine, quite a few of them would be at each other's throats for things that they believe or think or profess, stuff like that. I don't like scoundrels and I don't like evil. I'd say I'm a bit intolerant to those things, but I'm fascinated with fascinating people who do fascinating things and have clearly fascinating minds. I suppose so long as there's a good heart in it, then I'm fine with that. But I'm just saying that I love Rubinstein's playing. I have actually the entire, I think it's the RCA box of all of his recorded legacy. Of course, I have lots of other things. My LPs are pretty much include all of the recording stuff from the 50s and the 60s, especially the big chunk of Chopin that he recorded in the studio in the 60s. Friedman's is entirely different. And then, of course, there's other people I listen to that are quite different. But Um, I enjoyed my time with Bilson and studying the historic performance practice. I continue to do that. I think my first doctoral recital I did at Boulder actually was on a forte piano, solo and chamber music stuff. So I continue to do this, but my interest, I figured, come on, when you hear Mr. Bilson play, and there's some other folks that have done such amazing work, he's had some incredible students who've gone on in their own careers. I just was quite, I mean, I think I was attracted to the Romantic era, but very interested in trying to hear it in their own ears and what they've done. So I was lucky I started to hear pianos, and then I went to Europe, and over the time I've managed to have access to some wonderful things. And there's some builders that are manufacturing like a new Graf, but based upon, say, an 1835 Graf piano, for example. And then all the guys that are building forte pianos, and Margaret Hood, who built an 1816 copy of the was it Stein? Or was it the name a little longer? I'm sorry, I'm spacing on it. But a magnificent piano. That would have been, Beethoven knew the instrument, Mendelssohn liked the instrument, and it was built by the woman who took over the piano company, ran it for some time, and the instruments were one of Brahms's favorites. And they're one of those companies which ended in the later 19th century because they weren't interested in adapting to the new design models that had come out after the mid-19th century. Erard stopped in 1899, and I know that I'm not saying the right word, I'll write it up on the screen. The Andreas Stein was the piano that was contemporary with Mozart, and it could have been, was it Jeanette or something like that? I think it was still a Stein piano. Stein something anyway, that they also, it was her descendants, but they stopped manufacturing. But Liszt, or Brahms's final piano was a straight strung instrument in his home that he preferred. So that's preface, typical of me, but this is a wonderful book. I'll put it up on the screen so you can see it more clearly. I highly recommend it because it's very readable. For me, there's a tremendous amount of information to pay attention to because I'm reading it that way, and it's satisfying that way. But I'd say he kind of tries to define probably where the grand tradition or the great tradition began. He feels it started with Liszt. It's interesting, there's a quote in there about the time he's talking about trying to date the beginning of this great tradition of romantic piano playing. Because Friedrich Wieck, who was Clara's father and who opposed in the courts the marriage of Robert Schumann and Clara for several years, he was a well-known piano teacher, and his stating at the time was, well, it's all going to hell now because the great period of piano playing was basically the period between Mozart and Mendelssohn, and that he thought was the most extraordinary kind of playing. But it's very interesting. I mean, so what I've read in here so far, he talks to some extent about the nature of the pianos at the time and how some people talk very specifically about the techniques that were used. It seems that for a number of the instruments, earlier on especially, the whole idea of employing a great deal of upper body strength and even what they would call a lot of heavy arm weight would not have worked with some of the instruments. I know that for a fact. I had a really tough experience when I was at Ithaca with Mr. Bilson, and I'd spent a week or two on the forte piano, and within a week's time I had to come back into Wisconsin and perform the Weber trio, I think G minor is it, with flute, cello, and piano on a modern piano. Oh my God, it was so hard getting back on the modern instrument because it was comparably so heavy and required a different touch because you basically only play with the fingers and little attacks maybe from in the forearm because it's a very percussive and quick delivering instrument that gives you such clarity and variety of articulation and dynamics in a more punctuated way than a contemporary instrument. And then just the contemporary instrument, you've got more gram weight to move in the keys, and it was hard getting back in shape within a week to be on the modern piano. And to some extent, I think I was just watching a really cool video on YouTube. I don't have the exact name here, but I'll put it up for you, or even the address for it on YouTube, that had famous pianists playing a piece of music by the composer on the composer's piano, and then they play it on the modern piano. They're making those connections. It's a really cool one. I hadn't even finished by the time I started to do this recording. But I'll post it so you can look at it. It's really fascinating, especially in some cases. I think the older pianos and the way the artist is drawn to play it, I find it the older piano sometimes really pulls one in to a, well, certainly a different sound aesthetic and almost an interpretive way of playing that. In some ways, I think it's more effective on the new instrument, on the old original instrument. Well, he gets into the instruments and then technical things, and I had made it through where I was getting into the later 19th century, where Liszt was commenting, for example, on the length of these recitals nowadays when he was an older man. And of course, what he called a recital back in his touring career for about 10 years, very different from what we think of as a piano recital. But the interesting thing is these guys in the later 19th and going into the early 20th century, I know, having studied with Howard Clark from Juilliard, that the tradition going back into Arthur Rubinstein's time, you know, a New York recital was 2.5 hours, and if you had encores, you were in there for 3 hours, you know, more or less. And I think we've seen where that's changed in more recent years. Sometimes we got a little shorter. Now apparently they're getting a little longer again. But there's one really interesting where he's looking at this immense program that Paderewski played. And then somebody wrote down all the encores that he played afterwards. And it had to have lasted, the encores had to have lasted at least 45 minutes. And the concert itself easily was 2.5 hours plus, just with the length, the known length of some of the repertoire. That was a good sized program. So that means that recital was 3.25 to 3.5 hours. And that was not apparently so unusual back in those days. But anyway, I'm fascinated with the access that we have to recordings, with the amazing musicological research that's been done to create new editions of music. Elmer and I have also in past shows showed an interest. I find it very interesting, the idea of using the Hans von Bülow edition of the Beethoven sonatas for study, because I remember pointing one out. I don't know if it's the Opus 109 or something like that, but you know, it's just a little bit on the page, but there's at least as many notes on the bottom of that first page and running into the next page as there's music on the page. So there's a lot of critical information. And my thinking has been in some ways that for inexperienced pianists who really don't have enough sense yet of style and historical information and all that, I'm not averse to the idea of having them learn from a critical edition by a really important pianist of the past. I mean, maybe why wouldn't you want to study Chopin music edited by Alfred Cortot, for example? Could be very interesting. There's also the Paderewski edition, which has got some more modern notations from Polish scholars. But then, of course, there's Liszt, there's Ignaz Friedheim, no, not Ignaz Friedman, Arthur Friedman, his editions of some of Liszt's music, things like that. I think with the fingerings and the information that's given, it could be very helpful to begin to build a sense of interpretation and such. But anyway, I'm typically getting off on my own side paths to things. But this is After the Golden Age by Kenneth Hamilton, something that I'm reading, and I'll continue to just update you as I make my way through it. It's a lot of what interests me now is really digging back into history archaeologically as best we can, and not reproducing it in some dry scientific way, but really try to capture the energy and the mind and the heart that was in the music making at the time, for us to maybe hear something that's very different. Because if you're lucky and your grandparents or even great-grandparents live long enough, things change, people. Constantly. Things are constantly changing. Sometimes, and I think because we're very fascinated with things from the past in many cases, we have such wonderful opportunities to hear music on historic instruments performed very likely in a manner that was as true as one could get to past time. And they're great fans and devotees who would sooner listen to that than they would a modern performance. So there you go. That's historic performance practice. Hello again, everybody. This is Dimitri. We're going to continue with the show now. And here is the star of the show, Dr. Marc. Mr. Elmer isn't here. Hello, Dimitri. We're back. Take a little break there. Get up, stretch. I'm not just doing this. I'm not doing the show for egotistical reasons or making it long. Well, it's long because I'm talking so much, but also I wanted to make sure that we did at least 40 minutes or something like that, because the microphone had been pretty much clicking out after a half hour to 45 minutes or so recently, and I want to make sure that we got the problem solved and everything's working. So if this show ends up on our YouTube channel, then that means I think that we got it worked out, Dimitri.
Yes, I think so. I think it's going to be okay.
Okay. So, I've been talking about books as part of PSI Undercover. And the last one I want to present, this is also important to me because it's a project that I've become quite interested in. Given some personal experiences and queries, and I think it also comes out of maybe some of my own personal history and family history. I've shared this before. Artists are born and come from, I think, various kinds of backgrounds and experiences. There is a known phenomenon for artists often maybe having the kernel of creative energy in them, and then it's fed and it blossoms in certain kinds of environments that feeds them. Of course, I'm spacing on this because I only thought about it right now. I'll put the name up, but there's a wonderful book by psychiatrist, doctor of psychiatry. And she's written about genius and the conditions of especially manic depression and depression, and also schizophrenia and things like that. But and occasionally we mentioned some things. Peter or something, right? That Elmer talked about, the British guy who's a real fellow who was both a composer and a music critic, and he presumably didn't know about his other halves. His real split personality like that. They made a movie about his life. It was really quite interesting to look into. The one book that I have now, I'll put some of this information up on the screen and everything with her name because I can't remember it, but it's a very compelling thing where she goes back into history as far back as Alexander the Great, for example, comes down through history like with Abraham Lincoln, Churchill, looking at the impact, a considerable impact that various human beings have had on human history in the course of human, one might say, progression or movement towards who we are now. The ones that we really remember for some amazing, significant achievements or surviving through tremendous catastrophic periods. And she takes her divining ability as a scientist and a doctor and determines if they're manic depressive, they're manic depressive 1 or 2, and different things like that based upon things that they said themselves about their conditions, about their minds, about dreaming and so forth, and what other people said about them. Her argument ultimately in the later 20th century was that with the movement with drugs meant to help psychotic problems, she was concerned that there may be an actual chemical leveling off, which, and just the question, a lot of genius in our history has been connected with what we in contemporary times would refer to as mental abnormalcy, one might say. What might this do to the human species if we were to be able to diminish or delete those conditions from the people? And would we have any leaders or geniuses or ecstatically, inspired people? It's interesting to me. I'm and a partner. My partner. I refer to her as my wife. We've never married actually, but Laura. Her family background is Scottish on her mother's side and Muskogee Indian on her father's side, and it's been interesting to me that in a lot of shamanic and pagan cultures, way back, the Indians, for example, in North America, there's interesting stories and things written down about this, that medicine men as such, or also females, medicine women, were often recognized because of certain qualities that they betrayed as very young children. And they, seeing a tendency with these people, they had a knack for things, and sometimes they would, if they were there, they would then give that young person's training over to the present people that were involved in healing and knowing knowledge in the tribes. And in some cases, if the medicine man had children of his own, they found that at least one of them often would have similar qualities like the father, and other times like the woman, the mother. And I think they understood without understanding that sometimes this stuff is passed along genetically. I think I read that the tendency towards depression, manic depression, is generally thought of nowadays as being passed through the mother's line. Frankly, that would be true in my family. So what I got into by talking about this to start with, it sounds a really fascinating topic, is being victimized, and I've shared that before. My mom suffered terribly, I think, from depression, and then sometimes she was a little manic-y too. So she probably was manic depressive. And she was very eruptive, and very physically violent, where her parents had not been with her. My father wanted so much to keep his family together because his parents had gotten divorced when he was like 9 years old. And he swore that would never happen in his family. And I think in order to try to keep the peace in the family, because, Mom would often launch it against him, he eventually took a job working second shift, so he wasn't home a lot. And that created all kinds of issues for me. But I said before, I thought, until I was about the age of 10, I thought maybe my mom might kill me and I'd never grow up, because the beatings were quite brutal. As I've discovered over time, physical violence, well, I think it was, sometimes people knew about certain families, but other times it was very secret, very private, and one didn't know. And then, of course, violence manifests in different ways. But fundamentally, it wounds the spirit. It can really harm the person physically, mentally. It can create some serious problems. It can have very damaging effects on a person, but in some cases, I feel like with all three of us kids that grew up with Mom, I think we inherited both of our parents' brilliance, good minds and talents and skills. And then each one of us kids became great survivors and worked really hard to achieve what we wanted to do. And I was, I think, very effective in finding teachers and other adults who were supportive of me in my endeavors that made it possible to grow up and achieve the things that I wanted to do. At some point when I was living in Japan, I experienced Japanese shiatsu and became quite interested. And I apprenticed myself to a woman, studied Chinese medicine theory as it was applied in Japan, and I then came back to the States and got a certification in it. And my work began to, I began to have a number of clients who came to see me. I'll be very specific. It was 50%, let's put it this way, of all the clients that came, I think 75% might have been women, generally, 65%. But 50% of those women, at least, had suffered what I began to term sexual impropriety. Rape, or incest, or various kind of ways that their innate femaleness and female identity was attacked, was suppressed, they were oppressed. And I didn't advertise this stuff, but I think it's probably common in the healing world for people like that to appear. But I had quite a few, and I went to my teacher, my mentor, Susan, and mentioned it to her. And she knew we had to divulge to a certain extent our private histories, not so much that, people needed to know this, but we needed to know it so that we could work on our own healing and try to clear things so that we could get as close to an opportunity to handle pure energy and work with it without being adulterated by our own things. Or, for example, when working with someone or evaluating them, not somehow our own issues bleeding into that. We had to learn how to discern and separate those things. But she said, you've done a great deal of work, as you shared with me, overcoming the things that you faced as a child and as a younger man. Did you ever think, because she always talked about, I talked about, we're always sending out signals and energies into the universe, and we all have a radio antenna up, and we're attracting and sending out all that. She said, my guess is that these women and people, sometimes they were guys, are coming to you because somewhere out there in that universal expanse, they get a message. This is a guy who's kind of worked some things out and can help. So I had a lot of clients. There's two specializations. I became quite interested in the application of Chinese medicine for mental and emotional imbalances. And I also had a number, probably a total of 35, 36 people in my practice that suffered from cancer at different times. And there was interesting applications as well there. Well, anyway, here in Columbus, in a very different way, but having to do with oppressed people. Also because of my field. I mean, I think we're all aware of this. I mean, so many of these wonderful artists, Arthur Rubinstein, Ignaz Friedman, Daniel Barenboim, I mean, tons of violinists, my gosh. Michel and Heifetz, Horowitz pianist. They were all Jewish, you know? Not that everybody was Jewish, but Horowitz famously said, there are only three kinds of pianists. Three pianists. There are Jewish pianists, there are homosexual pianists, and there are bad pianists. Well, I don't think he was right, but not far off the mark in many cases. I am the director of the oldest extant German singing organization in North America, the Columbus Minor Corps. I also subsequently became the regional director, and I'm also then from 2018, I think so, or 19, anyway, down in San Antonio, I was elected to become the national director of the NASB, and I still am. Asked me to do it again. I love Wagner. As my favorite opera in the world is Parsifal. I embraced the German aspects of my family. It's on my father's side. I'm Dutch from the Frisian Islands, and then we have family from the Alps in both Austria and Germany. Franz Gruber, who wrote the music for Stille Nacht, Silent Night, is an ancestor of mine. My mother's side are Norman French from Normandy, mostly, and then the other family, the Martins, the Rambeys were from France. Were from up in the Lake Country and into southern Scotland. It was kind of Scottish and English. And here and there, there's a Welsh grandmother. There's some Irish folks that made it in. Typical American, right? I was quite drawn through my piano studies in my teen years. I don't know exactly why, but Beethoven really hit me quite hard, and Brahms. And I remember being in German class, and we were in the German club afterwards, after school, and Mr. Reichel showed a travel video from Germany, and there was a Rheindampfer, one of the boats that goes down the Rhine River in Germany, and it was showing the castles on the side of that river, and they were playing the fourth movement of Brahms' First Symphony. And in the dark, as I was watching that, I just was moved to tears, and I just swore to myself inside, I am going there. I am going to go there. I'm going to live there, and I'm going to study there. And I studied German, high school, college, and I did get in the exchange program and went to Tübingen University, was there, and then subsequently I've been back many times, 5 or 6 times, and for extended periods of living and working there. I was very fortunate to be in Bayreuth and doing some work there, and I've been in some of the other great cities and did some work and performed. Yeah, and in other times, biographically, I've been just surrounded by and involved, and the Midwest, come on, with German people. And just to feel very proud of the fact that when you look at the accomplishments of the German culture, certainly in music, but literature and poetry, the sciences and medicine, later on I would say, but even earlier on, architecture as well, and lots of things. the Germans were an incredibly competent and brilliantly productive, creative peoples. There were a lot of various people mixed in with that. To be of the German people back in the past was basically meant you weren't Russian or Slavic, you weren't Latinate, which is French or Italian, and you weren't the English, although they were probably cousins related, right? And most everything else then in all of Europe was considered kind of German, or we lived together and we worked together, so we're German. And then there were some that were not German. Of course, I'm talking about the Jewish people. And I won't get into the whole history of that. But Jews have been living in Europe for a long time. They were known as very brilliant scientists and doctors that people in the Middle Ages sometimes more secretively went to for help because they brought abilities out of the Middle East where they were really quite far advanced in terms of some medical knowledge and practices. But let's put it this way, with the creation of the Roman Church, and it's only been, I think, in the last, this is 2025, to 2022, maybe, when St. Francis wrote, and I'll put it up on the screen what the official Latin name is, but basically it was the Catholic Church no longer blaming the Jews for the death of Christ. They were putting that to the ash heap of history. Because that had been one of the premises. When I was growing up with my dad, I had Jewish friends and we knew Jewish people, especially being a musician over time. Wow. I've known plenty of Jewish people, very close friends. But I remember growing up with my dad's fundamentalist church. And what always struck me is that they were always fascinated with Israel, with the Jesus stuff. But there's always this thing about the Jews. Well, of course, they're the ones that had to kill. No, Romans did it, but they're the ones that betrayed him and turned him over. That's why they've been punished ever since. That's what I was told when I was learned at that time. I don't suggest that I believe that, because the first Christians were converted Jews. They practiced early Christianity, right? Jesus was a Jew who professed this new these new ideas, which became thought of as Christianity. The complete realization of the coming of the Christ and the Messiah who would save the people. And I myself am also a practitioner of Buddhism, and Quakerism had a huge influence me in the Christian realm. So I'm not preaching or confessing something here, or professing something. But I've been fascinated. I'm fascinated with history. I study it very intentionally. And I am moved and crushed by things. I remember years ago, I got really excited about following my German heritage. And I watched Hogan's Heroes and loved that. And I had a paper route, and I got a subscription to the Time Life Pictorial History of the World War II. And it was these books, all kinds of information and stuff. And I was also attracted to the idea of the power and the organization and the achievements and stuff, but of the Nazis early on in their time. And just figured, well, that's kind of, the Germans getting it together and doing what they're really capable of doing. I was naive and didn't know about some things, and I was pretty young yet. I was only 14 or something. And I was taking piano lessons at Wittenberg, and I was reading at the time, I got William Shire's book on World War II. And I remember 2 weeks in a row, I was sitting outside waiting for my mom to come pick me up after my piano lesson. And it was a while. Because one of the weeks, I forgot the professor said he couldn't be there for my lesson. And so I had the whole hour and a half, 2 hours to wait for Mom to come get me. We didn't have cell phones in those days. And she wouldn't have been home for me to call her anyway. So I read 2 chapters that is a William Shire's book about the Holocaust and the camps and things. I was so moved by what I read, I was almost physically ill. It was not terribly hot, but I was sitting outside, but I really thought I was going to throw up. The pain was so real. And then just to read about and the systematic way that they went about it. I kind of had a crisis in my life because of everything that I had been excited about devoting myself to. I thought, what the hell is this? What happened? I mentioned it to my mom. She said some things. Your family isn't always the best place to go in a conservative town for stuff like that. I was able to talk to some teachers a little bit more about it. I talked to Professor Wynn about it, my piano teacher. And I found that, I suppose the solution that some people told me and everything, well, Nazism is a very unfortunate period of history for the whole world, to some extent maybe especially for Germanic people, because they got kind of hung out to dry with this blight on their nation. But then there were hundreds of years previous to that, and then years subsequently, where there have been, particularly subsequently, great moves on the part of the German nation to apologize and to make reparations and to find new ways of thinking and being. And then just think about the past. But as I got to know Jewish people, and I saw a film one time of about Fort Wengler, and the camera was moving around the inside of the hall that they played in, and there was an empty space. And every chamber, I think there was a door underneath it. There was a marble representation, and we have a bust of one of the great composers with their names under it. And it was very interesting to me that at one point, one of those spaces was empty. There was no name and there was no bust. Well, that was Mendelssohn's spot, and the Nazis had him removed. I think Mahler was very popular back in those days, in the Nazi days. The Nazis worked really hard to delete Jewish influence on the culture and to try to reduce it as much as possible, in addition to, of course, murdering millions of people and putting them in camps and destroying a lot. Well, I found some wonderful music in German, in Yiddish, at this wonderful local music shop. Stapleton's. No, isn't that what it's called? Might be wrong about that. I will look it up and make sure I get the right name down. And I brought the music in and tried it with my courses because I thought, this is from German culture. This is songs that are part of the traditions. They were somewhat modern settings, but the stuff went back in the 19th century. And in general, the men were pretty favorable, but there were some cranker ones in the female group. And one of the daughters came up and talked. She said, you may get some resistance from some of the older ladies in there because there was some older men like that in the organization. They had been part of the exodus after World War II of peoples moving hither and thither throughout Europe because they were kicked out of one area and had to go somewhere else. A lot of Germans who had existed elsewhere in Europe, but then, of course, with the Lebensraum stuff, the Germans had expanded into those areas as well. But after the influence and the violence of the Nazis, they were all pushed out. We don't want no Germans here. So there was a particular family where they had been based in the Crimean Peninsula in Russia, and they'd been there before the Nazis. One of the fellows who was German was from Romania, from the Transylvania area. He also, as a young boy, had to travel with a wagon in the family because the Germans were thrust out of there as well. But they preceded by a generation or two the Nazis. But there was a feeling on the part of some of those Germans that who better to blame than, well, it's the Jews. Because, if it hadn't been for the Jewish this, Jewish that. And I'm not saying in defense, everybody finds a reason in a scapegoat, right? But there's some antipathy going back to those days. Terrible deprivation and loss and all kinds of stuff like that. Terrifying stories. I met a fellow, I'd say there's two guys in the Manor Corps. One is a dentist, and the other is as a medical doctor. They both have claimed and kind of, I suppose, discovered Jewish Jewish blood in their family lineage. And the dentist actually became kind of started to reach out through another German organization. Met a woman in, I'd say conservative, not super conservative, but relatively conservative Jewish temple in Columbus. And her father had taken his family and got them the hell out of Germany in enough time before things happened and moved to the United States. But he never talked about things, never talked about the past, nothing like that. And then eventually died, and she was just still curious. And also her father passed on. She kind of wanted to know, where did I come from? She knew that they had started in Germany. I don't think, yes, she was born there. No, she couldn't have been when they left. But her father was. And of course, his citizenship was stripped from him and he had to leave. So she approached the dentist guy. And they kind of got together somehow and got to meet. And it turns out her family was from very close to where the dentist was from in Germany. He has family there still. Very strong connections. He contacted his cousin and said, this very good Jewish friend of mine wants to come back, and you take her to where her family was from, which is about 30 kilometers away, and show her around and let her look and see what she needs to find. So she did find the house and a few houses that the family had belonged to the family. And then she, in the cemetery that was there, she found some older tombstones of some of her family. Her father's immediate period family were all murdered in the camps and died. So who knows where their bodies are, etc. But there were some older relatives that were actually buried in the cemetery in that village. So the process is she went through and she decided she wanted to get her German citizenship back. She wanted to reclaim that part of herself that was German, that was missing from her life and her identity. So that my dentist friend helped her with the whole process here in the States, and she succeeded in getting dual citizenship. And she's a Jew, and wanted to do that. Then my medical doctor friend, I think he knew this, but he hadn't been, it just kind of fluttered away with time and everything. His grandparents had immigrated from Germany after the First World War. His grandfather had come over and started to carve out a farm in the rainforest in Brazil. And then eventually another family came over. Those Germans tend to go down to South America all the time. And the woman was Jewish. And she and Renee's grandfather, fell in love, and they got married. And I don't even know if they went to church there in Brazil, but he was probably, who knows, Catholic or Protestant, I don't know. He had been a soldier in the First World War, and she was Jewish, and they loved each other, and they got married. And then His parents were born there, and then Renee was born there. And anyway, in more recent years, he's become a very, very spiritually adept and very spiritually, deeply spiritual person. And he felt maybe some of that, in a way, was connected with his grandmother, with that, the mystic things that he's interested in. Because she apparently was quite a mystic Jewish lady, very interested in certain things, and the family always talked about that stuff and knew it, but I don't think there was any opportunity to practice the faith. And I'm pretty sure his parents, certainly neither one of them, I don't know, I think it was his father side that he's talking about. So through his father's side, his grandmother was Jewish. But he started to claim this part of himself and explore it. And he's been looking at relations with between Jewish people and German people here in Columbus. Well, this led me to something that I was curious about myself. In my spiritual journey and practice, I remember there was, I don't remember who it was, but it was a guy who was talking about this, and then I remember discussing it with a woman who was, worked with fabric arts. And this guy had said that our life, and this is not an original idea, I've heard it in many times, many places, our life is a tapestry that is constantly being woven every moment as we progress through our lives. And as we look behind us, we can see all the fibers of the experiences that we've had woven together to a grand picture, which continues up until our death. It's important in that person's thinking to think of that tapestry with all of its components, all of the things that have happened, as something to be held and embraced as having brought us to where we are now, where that might be. And that there's always opportunity to change things. But one of the things I've learned from all the things I've read and studied, and I know people who have amnesia about things in their lives. They don't remember. Particularly certain kind of people who suffered violence and things. But for that one person I'm thinking about, there are some holes there in her life. She doesn't remember. And she often shares with me a lot of memories and speaking out loud and sharing stories to me about things. And over time, I've seen her begin to patch a few places. There's still some holes there. And then I've, explored considerably the history of the Holocaust and post-Holocaust and the people dealing with that, and all these things. And I was always curious about my family and my lineage, where I came from and all that. I've never done all those tests. But we have a sufficient oral tradition that I know how it goes back at least to the very early 19th century. But I think about those people who had patches of their tapestry ripped out, or they themselves have ripped it out, or there are holes there. And I thought specifically about how much I love German culture, and then as I studied very deeply, how much the Jewish people contributed within the German nation, amongst the German people, to so many of these things, so many of these achievements. So I'm interested in working on a project that inspires perhaps to reconcile immediately here in Columbus the Jewish and German communities. Not that they're necessarily antipathetically divided, but to get something going. And I maybe, as I start to develop this more and work on it, to share more of the details as we're going along, if it takes off. But I found this book in my research, and unfortunately there's a big sticker over the front cover, which I can't get off. But it's called Forbidden Music, the Jewish Composers Banned by the Nazis, by British writer and music authority Michael Haas, Haas. I'll put all this up on the screen so you can see it. I've started to read this book and I'm very excited about it. This guy is an academically trained doctor, and I don't know, he hasn't said so far about himself. The biography that's available is a more professional one, and he hasn't as yet confessed anything. I don't know if Haas, AAS, if he has a Jewish background or anything, but he's very much devoted himself to this. He was involved with London and Decca Records back in the 90s, doing a series of recordings that they called Int Artete music. And I'm trying to remember how you say it in English. Int Artete means kind of the opposite of artistic. And I think it means something like it's a derogatory consideration of there was in 1938, I think it was in Nuremberg, there was a famous art show that was put on called In Artete Kunst, I think it was. And the Nazis had assembled all this stuff that they wanted to demonstrate compared to certain great achievements by true non-Jewish German artists. This is what great art is, this is what great stuff is, and this is depraved crap. I'll put up the translation of Int Artete. I know what it means, but it's a word that I can't quite get clear in my mind right now. This reads very well. I think it would read well for anybody who's interested in the topic. And it reads also well enough, again, that it has sufficient information in it that if you want to be the type like I am to get my pencil or my markers out and start going through stuff, that's in there. So there's a good preface and introduction in and of themselves. And I made it through the first chapter, which is a kind of a background history. I probably didn't finish speaking about Michael Haas because he continued to work on, and if he's still alive, and I believe he is, he's not that old, he has worked in Europe with various Jewish museums like in Vienna and organization in England that tries to recollect and represent what could very well be lost cultural knowledge and things from the time of the Jews being murdered and severely attempt to stamp them out. But he goes into something that's interesting because I'm almost done. When I did my conductor's video series for people working on conducting music in the German Volkslied, popular folk music tradition, like in the Männerchor. And it is made specifically for people who come in who aren't as familiar, not at all, with the history and with the traditions, but maybe have the musical chops, but they don't have the historical and cultural information to really know how to work in this area. It's a somewhat specialized area, I suppose. But I remember doing a presentation about the early history of the development of the Männerchor and how it became politicized in the 19th century, especially from the period of the Napoleonic Wars and through the great 1848-49 revolutionary period, and continued until nationhood in 1871 with the Prussians leading Germany towards the German nation towards unification. Um, so he covers in the first chapter. I mean, and I think if anybody knows any of this stuff, the Jews have been in Europe forever, since way back, beyond the medieval period, probably from the Roman era, and then the collapse of that into what became the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and so forth. But they were always separated from the rest of society, most everywhere, wherever the church was, because of their original sin against Christ. And in various places they were more welcome and less welcome and so forth, and did well, didn't do well, depends. But they seem to be relatively well integrated into the German people and lands. They live separately, but they seem to work together well enough. But he starts about with, let's say, the early 19th century, with the end of the Napoleonic era, the creation of the Congress of Vienna, and the identification of the new states, and some certain changes that were being made. It's interesting that, well, no, I'm trying to keep it short, but about a generation later, in 1848-49, turns out there were revolutions all over Europe, these small places. But famously in Germany, down in Dresden, this is when Wagner got involved, writing things about creating a great republic and getting rid of the monarchies and all that. That got him exiled to Switzerland for 25 years before he could be brought in by Mad King Ludwig into Bavaria. And then the Minnecorps themselves in America pretty much began. Now there were some German choirs, groups like Philadelphia, that would have gone back to at least the 1820s, I think. But the Columbus Minnecorps, for example, was mostly here because those German people who had fought for or hoped for at least a change away from severe absolute monarchy and aristocratic rules to more modern, republic type ideas of rule from within the people, and people having more control over the countries. Now, what they did to the people after the conclusion of those revolutions, pretty harsh, and people just said, screw it. And there was a big wave of German immigration that ended up in northern Ohio, but especially up in Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and farther west in the Dakotas, and down in Iowa, places like that. But especially in Wisconsin and Minnesota, a lot of Scandinavians and Germans moved there. And then what he talks about is the idea of the German state and then the German nation. There were German speakers in Austria, but there were a lot of other people in the Habsburg Empire, basically the Holy Roman Empire, which had moved from farther up in Aachen down to Vienna in the 1600s and remained there. So there was always a little bit of confusion about how much the Austrian Germans, or Austria as a whole, or at that time not just Austria, but the entire empire down there, would fit into what would be a German state, because it would have included a lot of other people, especially from the Habsburg Kingdom and Empire. So it's apparently between 1867 and after 1871 when the Prussians defeat the French and become a nation. The two countries, Austria had taken on the Hungarian kingdom and combined to become Austro-Hungary. And the Emperor Franz Joseph I became the emperor of both Austria and Hungary, but then that also included the Balkans, so a lot of Slavic people and this and that. And it was concluded when Germany became unified, there were a lot of German-speaking Austrians who figured that that part of Austria, at least, would become part of the new unified German state. But the Germans themselves thought no, and then the Austrians wouldn't go with it because they wouldn't want to split up or lose a great deal of territory and all that. But the both of them wrote new constitutions, and this is what it's getting at, which was very important, that established real equal rights and freedoms for all, especially male citizens, in these new nations. And that included the Jews, Jewish men. So he cites one particular fellow. There was a composer named Ernst Schreker, who was, I knew the name, but let's put it this way, back in the early 20th century, he was thought to be probably a greater opera composer than Richard Strauss. And there was one famous music critic who felt that Schreker was the legitimate heir to Wagner. He was that important and significant. He taught in Berlin, at the Berliner Hochschule for Musik, and then at the Prussian Academy at the end. His father had been a Jew in Vienna who really took advantage of this new constitution when it was passed and changed his name. I'm not sure that he necessarily westernized himself, but he did change his name, make it a bit more Western and less Jewish. And he advertised for a second wife, divorced his first wife, the Jewish woman, and got a new wife. She answered the ad, I guess, and it worked out. People did that. You know, there's things in the paper where you had, that was kind of, instead of email or being online, I guess, people met by personals. Turns out this woman, although she didn't have really very much money, she was part of the old Germanic Austrian aristocracy that is still to this day known as the Thurn, Thurn, and Taxis, Taxis families, which also includes some other family names. I think Furstenberg or Borg, and I think it was Waldstein as well. But I might be wrong about that. But one of them was a very famous supporter of Beethoven earlier back then. But he married into aristocracy, and what Michael Haas says is it would have been impossible just a few years before for this to happen. But no way could a Jewish man marry a true German woman, and especially an aristocrat. They had Ernst, and he was talented, grew up for he was very talented, very successful, and all this and everything else. Well, the Nazis show up and start to do their anti-Jewish thing, and one of the first things they do, very close to home in Berlin, they ban the performances of Ernst Schreker's music, and they make sure he's fired from the Berlin school, which is why he teaches for a while at the Prussian school. For whatever reason, that was okay for a while. They did not have to murder him because he was so depressed, and I mean, ultimately he was not allowed to have a life, barely live. He couldn't teach. His fame was taken away from him. His music was not allowed to be printed or anything like that. He died of a heart attack when he was 54 years old and was gone, I think by 34 or 35, before Kristallnacht, before the Nazis really got quite systematic about getting rid of their Jews. But what he talks about is that there was immediate movement on the part of the Jewish people once they got that equality and freedom to really embrace Germanness and become so German and do all these wonderful things. And interestingly, in our country, I would say in general, we expect that when people come to this country, I think, we want them to embrace what it means to be American. We got a lot of bad things about our history and about what we've done, but, you know, we're supposed to be a country where people are governed by the law, more or less as equals. And that we're supposed to, you can celebrate your heritage and this and that's sometimes encouraged very much, but you're an American now. And that is usually applauded here in this country. At the time, back in Germany and to some extent in Austria, but especially in Germany, the German people were, like, who do these people think they are? They're not Germans, they're Jews, this old prejudices and all this stuff. The laws may have made things different, but the people's opinions and the things that they thought about for generations, long time, those didn't change so fast. And there's an interesting thing he talks about that Cosima Wagner, who was Wagner's second very important wife, she's the daughter of Franz Liszt. Had these magnificent diaries. I've got 2 huge books of hers, which are just the diaries. She writes 4 different entries in a 4 to 6 month period, where just after the founding of the German state, 1871, Constitution is completed in 72, 73 for sure, that Richard said today, she writes these things down, I think it's too early for the Jews to have equality in this country. And then she goes on to explain in more detail that Wagner even says, he said, if I had the opportunity to yet write Jugendtum in der Musik, Jewishness in music, which was a rather infamous, aggressive article, anti-Semitic, presumably. Well, it's held that way by most people. She actually says that Richard said, this is not really racism about the Jews, but it's about the fact that because of the way they've had to live all this time, separate from the society, and then rather aggressively in order to survive, make their businesses successful, take care of their families and all this kind of thing, they are extreme capitalists. They're money lenders, they loan money up for interest and all that kind of stuff. And I understand this was necessary as part of their history. But in terms of the ideal state, this is at least in Richard Wagner's mind, that they wanted to create, which was more egalitarian, recognizing the different class structures, but that legally and in terms of the government, that would not give anybody exceptional power privileges in the country, and with the idea that the Germans were celebrating their great Germanness through anticipated support of music and the arts and all those kinds of things. So, I mean, what he's talking about is something of a democratic social or social democratic state, which at that time historically was quite common in the thinking in Europe. I think very much probably because they're probably starting to catch on that this whole monarchy and aristocrat thing has been hell for a long time. And it's not that we have to get rid of them because French kind of overdid it, but we could kind of level it out. So it's interesting that in Cosima's entrances that he includes here, Wagner thought that maybe we should wait to bring the Jews in, maybe wait a generation or 50 years until we've really established it, because he was afraid that the immediate presence of the Jews in the culture, in the society, would lead to capitalist extremes that would ultimately harm the country. And looking back historically, not to blame the Jews necessarily, but that kind of did happen and certainly helped the rise of the Nazis, who were greatly supported by the capitalists, not just within Germany. I guess the thing that's interesting to me is that he's showing that, well, like in Schraker's case, he wasn't even Jewish. His father was, but according to Jewish law, as far as I know and understand, it comes through the mother's line. And his mother was a German aristocrat. She wasn't Jewish. The Nazis had just decided he was Jewish, And that was that. And of course, things got worse. But what's interesting to me in the first chapter, and it's not an apology or anything, but it's clear that there had been for the previous 100 years before the Nazis showed up, thinking about what the German nation is or was, what a German state would be, who would be included in that. And there were different camps of feeling like, well, we should focus on German. And then there were people who said, well, but there's people that have lived with us for eons, and they're fundamentally German because they're not Russians, they're not Latinate Italians or French, and they're not English. They're different. So what becomes interesting historically is that what the Nazis were proposing and created was the realization of a different version of what the German nation would look like, what it would be. And I'm not saying this is an excuse. Come on. People, if they know me, they know where my heart is with people with certain things. But I'm just interested in trying to know the whole picture and the truth as much as possible, because the victors write the history that we're told and the things that we're told. And there's been a lot of rewriting, and I've been fascinated as I've gotten older and have managed to study in a number of different areas. Old knowledge and old information, which is just as true as the stuff that we have been taught, but that we weren't taught and that we didn't know. I would like to have as full a picture before I check out as much as I can know about a number of things. And I think that explains my historic performance practice interest and love for old-time pianists and the way they played. And in this contemporary, present situation where I'd like to activate this idea of reconciliation, at least from a cultural point of view, for people to reclaim those parts of their tapestries which may be absent, which are absent, I know, in many cases, because relatively older, emotional, in certain realities, but it's possible. I definitely feel it's possible and has its benefits. So, Dimitri, we put together a pretty damn big show. Yes, we did, Mark. That was a pretty long presentation. I hope they didn't fall asleep. I'm still awake, though. Well, I appreciate it, Dimitri. So, that has been PSI Undercover, and I hope you enjoy what was shared today. As I said, if this goes up, this is a special edition, which was primarily done because I want to make sure everything works. And it's still blinking. The blue light was on the second time I turned it on. So I'm hoping that everything comes across. And I'll try to put up a lot of extra material on the screen to kind of give some more visual interest than just staring at us here and listening to a bunch of talk. But this is a great passion, and we missed Elmer Capitosh today, who's a very dear friend and colleague, and he's generally the one that provides the structure for our shows, and that's his seat right there, which Dimitri asked if he could sit in the actually we're comfortable in the studios. I said, I think it's okay. So I apologize to Elmer, but we just want to make sure that before we do our next official show, in 3 days, I think, that it's going to work. The equipment's going to work. So here's hoping that this will get up. I'll edit it and put it up, and that means that we should be good to go for future shows. And we'll see what Elmer brings in. And at least, since I did all my talking about these books and this stuff, I'll come back with some of these and do little reports about what I've been learning, what I'm gathering. But this gave me a chance to talk at length about some of my interests and things. And again, we'd like to encourage ever more participation from you, listeners, on both our Facebook page and our YouTube page underneath videos. And we have a page on Facebook devoted to Marc and Elmer's PSI. So that's it for today. From very beautiful sunny Ohio, where I think the temperature only reached 6 degrees, nonetheless. And it's just been me and Dimitri. And this has been Marc and Elmer's PSI, Piano Scene Investigations. Thank you very much, and see you again soon. Bye.
Goodbye, everybody. I'm going to Russia now. I'll be more far. See you. Bye-bye.
Okay, next time.
Oh, that went very well. Yes, I think. You have the ability to talk a lot, but most of the time it's interesting.
Well, I'm glad you think that. Thank you, Dimitri.